Thank you. Right. That's good. Right. Good?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Hi. Morning, everybody. And thank you. Thank you to you both for sharing. All three of you. I was referring to Oscar there. Right. What do you say to a room full of doctors about health and well-being? Especially when you know that it's your well-being that's being sacrificed. So there's a lot of knowledge in this room and a wealth of experience. And no doubt coupled with that, there's a lot of stress, burnout, exhaustion, trauma, and from what I've heard and sensed, a lot of cynicism too. So I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm probably not going to teach you anything. What I am going to do though is invite you or remind you to come back to what you know, and then ask you to commit for yourself to one thing that you can take from knowledge and put into practice. Because in my field of work, and I'll tell you more about what I do in a moment, I see a lot of common knowledge, but not common practice. And this well-being stuff, if this was easy, we would all be healthier and happier, fitter. It isn't easy. And so today we're going to relook what are the fundamentals that can really help support good well-being. And maybe you're doing them all. So today is like a check, like, great, I'm doing the right thing. And maybe you'll be like, actually, I'm not doing that. That's a bit of a blind spot. I could tweak that. But then you can't leave with 3 things to do because that's too much. I'm really going to ask you to commit to one thing. Because my objective today is if I can inspire you a little, if I can help you to maybe leave with one strategy that you can put into your life. So you could be single, you could have a child, a dog, you could be married, your circumstances, our circumstances are all different. So if you can find something to put into practice that suits your lifestyle, then maybe I think that could be a success. Would you agree? Great. Because I'd like you to leave here feeling as if you have the ability to manage your sense of performance better. And sure, that means perform better at work, but ultimately it means perform better as a human. So all aspects of your life. So I'd like you to be able to leave and feel as if you own the title CEO. And that doesn't mean taking over James' position, if that's his title. It's Chief Energy Officer. Because if you are your own Chief Energy Officer and you can mobilize energy on demand, that for me is one of the greatest assets you can have. So you can work 3 or 4 back-to-back shifts, be really physically, maybe even emotionally exhausted, but somehow you've got tools and techniques that you've practiced. So when you need them, you can actually use them. That can help you shift a little bit more energy so that you can connect with your child or with a loved one, or find the energy to maybe go out and have a bit of a social life. So that's what today's about. And well-being is exactly what the word says. So I've worked in well-being for a long time. This is my 22nd year. I qualified as a dietitian in 2000 in South Africa, so my accent is South African. However, my parents are from France, and that's really important. And I'll share why in a moment. But I always knew that I wanted to study medicine. There's no question. I did as a Girl Guide and a brownie. I don't know if anybody even remembers what those are. I was always doing the badges for like healing and first aid. And I worked at the blood donation clinic when I wasn't actually allowed to because I was too young, but I was there giving out biscuits and tea and watching the nurses. And then while I was looking into the university that I wanted to go to, part of the medical offering was dietetics. And being French, I love food. So I was like, oh my goodness, this is medicine and food. And so that's why I went down that trajectory. I was like, I'm going to study dietetics. I qualified as a dietitian. And then after 5 years of clinical practice, I realized that no one really goes to a dietitian for fun. you generally go once something is wrong, you've got a health issue. I dealt a lot with diabetes, irritable bowel conditions, heart disease. And so in 2006, I had an opportunity to work with a health insurer in South Africa. And we started doing proactive well-being programs together, videos, generating cooking courses to help people eat better while they were stressed and at work. And since then, this is really my love, is working with groups and ideally looking at how we can be proactive about our well-being, using nutrition as a foundation, but other aspects too, rather than waiting until things go wrong. And I know that you're in the workspace of things are really wrong when people are seeing you, right? And well-being is about being and doing. It's not theoretical, right? So you can think, and we know what is generally good for us. It doesn't always mean that we do it. And I sometimes feel that as medical and health practitioners, we sometimes feel that we're exempt, like the rules don't always apply to us. So I'm here to remind you that today is really about you. And a well is like a well of water. If you think of an oasis, if you're really thirsty, and like I've got a cracking throat, I've got a bit of post-nasal drip from hay fever. So I don't have COVID, and I'm hoping I don't go into a coughing fit. But I realize how important it is to hydrate with this. But all the time, when we're parched and thirsty, you spoke about UTIs and needing to drink. So I'd like the time that we have together between now and lunch, and I'm conscious that I'm standing between you and lunch, so I won't let you get too hungry. But I'd like this to be an opportunity for you to feel as if you've been hydrated, nourished, that you've come to a well of well-being. So even if you don't leave here and do anything, that's okay, that's your choice. But if you can leave there feeling a little bit more cared for than you did coming in this morning, that for me will be great. And when we're dealing with patients, as I know you are, it's difficult, right? There's this expression that I get quite touched by, is that a healthy person has 1,000 wishes. A sick person has just one, right? So ideally, we want to try and see how can we avoid getting to that point where we just have one wish, which is to get well. It sounds like you've definitely been at that place. And there's so much we can do that can help support us to do that. However, well-being, like this gentleman is making a wish. I don't know if anybody's been to the Trevi Fountains in Rome. Whenever I see wells, the idea of throwing in a coin and you make a wish is great. Well-being is not like that. You can't just make a wish to be well and then have it, right? You need to take action and have some strategies. So we're going to talk about what are strategies that can help you to make sure that you don't need to have just one wish. You could always be reasonably healthy, potentially have 1,000 wishes, and maybe pass on some of this knowledge, like you said, to those that need it the most. But ultimately, I don't want you to be thinking about your patients, about your loved ones, about anybody else. I'd like you to be selfless, not selfish, and really think about yourself. And you'll know you're smart and intelligent. Your intuition will tell you when I say something, and you get that feeling of like, that makes sense to me. Let that be the one thing that you potentially take back with you. And I don't know what it's like to work in your world. I don't. But as a wise friend once said to me, sometimes we need to step out of the circle to see the circle. So perhaps it's a gift that I'm here and I'm coming from a different circle, so to speak. And well-being, no matter what circle you're in, which circle you live in and work in, it's about principles. And I think the first principle I wanted to remind you of, which is an ancient one, popularized by Stephen Covey. Has anybody read or heard about him? He wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So you may remember the circles of influence and control. And he spoke about this concept of, let me draw this here. Everything in life, just about everything, we can put into different areas, starting with things that we are concerned about. So there's a lot of things that we are concerned about. However, we can't control everything. There's only a certain amount of things that we are concerned about that we can actually either influence, and then there's a very few amount of things that we can actually control. And why do I bring this up? Because when we think about things that concern us, and they can be big things, interest rates, crime, the weather is something we often speak about. We can be concerned about it, but we can't necessarily control it. And if we worry about it, it ends up feeling weighty, onerous, it takes lots of energy. And maybe if you have lots of energy, if you're feeling abundant and well, and you are your own CEO, Chief Energy Officer, like you feel great, you can then take energy beyond the things that you can control to try and influence things, become maybe more of an activist, and maybe even then really spend energy here on other bigger things. But I'm guessing that all of us in this room are here because potentially we are feeling drained or tired. And so this can become a bit of a survival strategy, is think about, well, if something is not within your range of control, can you, even if it is just for the time being, set it aside and rather focus on not even what you can influence, because maybe within the system and the NHS, there are things that if you really tried hard at, you can influence. But when your energy is limited, I would say, what if you just took a look at what you can control? What are things that you can control? Does anybody have an idea? Like right now in this room, in this minute, what can you control? You could be concerned about what I'm going to say. Is this going to be interesting? I'm going to have to like just pretend to be smiling at her and nodding. Or you could actually say, well, what's in my control is how I sit, how I breathe, how I direct my thoughts. Do I pick up my phone or not? My attitude. Yeah, so a lot, actually not a lot, everything that we're going to speak about, this overriding principle around well-being is to try not to expend too much energy on things that are outside of our influence and outside of our control. And to rather look at, instead of maybe blaming and shaming, as you mentioned, is to spend the next hour or so that we have together and go inward, and to also stay curious. Curiosity is another key principle. So there's the circles of control and then curiosity. Why would I say curiosity? Because when we are curious, Oscar's curious, right? Young children are curious. Curiosity keeps a growth mindset. It helps us stay open to potentially solutions and things that we might not have thought about. And it's often when we're highly stressed, and we see this in resilience studies, when we can lose our sense of curiosity, and that's also got to do with physiology, right? And I know you understand this, the stress response is powerful, and it kind of overrides parts of the brain when we go into that fight or flight, freeze or fold. And so we lose the sense of openness. And so we potentially miss things that could help us. We lose big picture thinking. We don't have creativity and spontaneity. And so trying to stay curious, especially when you don't understand things or things are new, or even just asking yourself, you know, isn't this interesting? So those 3 words, isn't this interesting, are something that I've tried to embed in my mind whenever something happens that causes me a bit of stress. So like, well, arriving at the hotel last night, there was a wedding going on. And even though I was in room 309, which is next to the other end of the hotel on the 3rd floor, the bass was coming through the bed. So I was lying there at 10:30 thinking, I really want to sleep well and wake up rested. But isn't this interesting? And when I said, so initially, I forgot about those 3 words for a moment, and I was a bit like stressed. I'm like, I can't change rooms, whatever, I'm not going to sleep. But the moment I said, isn't this interesting? Do you know what came up in my mind? That for 2 years, people were not able to meet and have weddings and dance. And I was like, I don't know the bride and the groom, but I am so happy for them. And that, in that second, my whole thought process changed. And somehow I fell asleep. And I feel pretty good today. So if you want to take that, is find a phrase like, isn't that interesting? That you just allow yourself to think when you have a moment of stress. The key though is to practice it when the stakes aren't too high. You don't want to wait to when there's blood spurting across the room to be like, oh, isn't that interesting? You want to be practicing it now when the stakes aren't high. You're sitting in a chair in a conference room and everything's relaxed, because we don't default to what we haven't practiced. So is there anybody that plays sports or, I don't know, does running or cycling or run events? Okay, so we know that, like, what do? Do you run marathons? Do you do cycling? Well, any kind of sport, right? You don't want to do nothing and then go out and run 5 miles or more. You want to practice so that when you get to the event or the charity walk, you're able to then do it. And so the well-being is also about practice. And it's not about the big things, it's about the small things that we practice. Consistency is better than intensity when it comes to well-being. Be consistent rather than doing not much and then trying to do too much overnight. And then, I mean, that's what diets are about, right? So I'm so happy that you said that you're going to go on a lifestyle change, because diets, the first 3 letters of the word diet, it's exactly, you know, it's about deprivation and denial. And it's like this 3 or 4 week program, this thing that we go on so that we come off. None of what I'm talking about is about that. I'd like you to think about what are small things that I can do consistently. Another great example of how we can look at things we can control and can't control is when we're driving. So I drove 4 hours to get here last night, and I was reminded about how you can't always control what happens around you on the roads. There can be diversions, traffic jams, things can go wrong. You could come across an accident. However, you can grip the steering wheel, grind your teeth, frown, lean forward, take fast, shallow breaths. Your inner critic can come out and say, you didn't leave on time, you should have done this, could have done that, who's made a mistake. And what's that going to do? That means you're focusing all your energy on that outward circle, like all the things that you're concerned about, but that you can't actually control. Or you can choose to let go of the steering wheel, hold it a bit more loosely, let your shoulders drop down, soften your breath, maybe even turn the corners of your mouth upward a bit, which sometimes can bring on a smile, and allow yourself to accept that you've done the best that you can. And arrive at the destination, the same place that you would have arrived if you were gripping and tense, but with so much more energy. So how are you right now? Is there any way that you could be a little bit more comfortable? Maybe sit a bit more back, allow yourself to drop into your breath, because as I said, well-being is not about doing, it's about being. I've got a lot to share, but I'm not just going to talk at you. I'm going to invite you to think about not just different aspects of well-being, but we're actually going to try a few things. And there might be things that you've done before, and I'd like you to stay curious about what's it like to do it now, and maybe it's something new. Because don't ever take my word for it, or anybody else's word for it, or an author's word for it. Is always try something. I always say try something once or twice, and then let your body tell you where if it is something that you could use. So when it comes to well-being, it's a big topic, right? I like to categorize well-being in 4 different areas. So we have our mental well-being, which is about this wonderful 4-pound universe that sits on our shoulders. And that's your ability to think, to problem solve, to remember, to stay strategic in times of high stress. You've also got your emotional well-being, which is everything to do with emotions, feelings, your heart. It is your emotional intelligence. It's the quality of your relationships. It's your ability to identify your own emotions and then articulate them and maybe even regulate them. And then we have our physical well-being, which is around everything to do with the body. So weight, energy, digestion, immunity, health numbers like blood pressure and all that stuff. And then we also have the sense of meaning. It could be your spiritual well-being. For some people, it's a faith or a belief. And generally, what I like to refer to as is we all have a sense of needing to belong. It's also your ability to give back. So you spoke about acts of kindness. And often, I don't know if you agree with this, but they're all important, right? And they're all interrelated. However, I know that if I were to stack these 4 dimensions and put them together in terms of like importance or a pyramid, if your physical well-being is not strong, so let's say you're sleep deprived, dehydrated, maybe starving, so your blood sugar is low, it's going to be harder for you to show up at your best emotionally and mentally, let alone have extra energy for meaning and contribution and giving back, right? So often with mental health, we focus a lot on, well, here are techniques to help your mind. And yes, they are good and they work, like helicopter thinking and reframing and the concept of curiosity and journaling and speaking. However, I don't think we pay enough attention to the fundamental around physical well-being. Like, are you hydrated? Are you getting enough of the different types of rest? And we know this stuff. Like I said up front, I'm not going to teach you anything new, but I know from doing this work with thousands of individuals that often the basic things become a bit like background noise. They become easy to ignore. So we're going to take a look at how strong is the base of that pyramid and then see it at how we can help you optimize your emotional, mental, and perhaps even your sense of meaning. I'd like to invite you to take any hand and imagine you've got a lemon in it and you want to get all the juice out of that lemon. So maybe you're making, I don't know, like a lemon sip, or you're making a margarita, depending on the day of the week. So squeeze that lemon, squeeze the lemon. You want to get every last bit of juice. Keep squeezing the lemon. Just a little bit more juice left. And notice what has happened to your breath. Did it stop? Held it? Okay. Okay, you can release the lemon. So there's a direct correlation between muscle tension and constriction and holding our breath. Very, I feel like it's always a shame to say in front of doctors and like give these simple examples. And maybe I should share that because most of my career has been taking scientific terms and evidence-based healthcare advice, but making it simple to understand, because I think often we can keep things complicated and people don't make a change, is that's the lens that I approach teaching with, because we remember often what's simple. And I hope that if anybody has any questions, or if you want to reach out to me after today, you're welcome to consider me one of your wellbeing partners. I'll share my contact details. And also if you're like, hang on, what was the science behind that? You know, because I'd like to think that I'm not woo-woo, even though some of the techniques are simplified so that people can actually use them. So back to squeezing the lemon. When we have tension, we make it difficult for our body to relax and breathe. And I was reminded of this. So 2 weeks ago, I was able to travel again to France. So all my family are in France. And I discovered that during COVID, my cousin taught himself to play the trumpet. And he was playing the trumpet. I was like, how hard can it be? So day 3, I'm like, Francois, let me have that trumpet. He's like, okay, cool. Has anybody tried to blow? It is not as easy as it looks after 2 years of practice. I mean, you can see I'm red-faced. I could not get a sound. The only thing that came out of that was a terrible cacophony. And after a few tries, and I mean, thank goodness I laughed at myself. So I laughed. I was like, let me stay curious. I don't have to get this right because I've got the strong perfectionist side of me, as I'm sure most of you do too. And I said to myself, what if I just relaxed a bit and didn't try so hard? Because I noticed my whole body was like squeezing the lemon, right? So I said to him, just give me a moment. And I took 3 or 4 deep breaths and I relaxed. And I didn't try. I just went, and this beautiful sound came out. And his eyes lit up. And he was like, you hit a do. You hit a do. You know, do, re, mi, fa. So I hit do, apparently. So it was a reminder again that when you're in a stressful situation, relaxing your body sometimes is the only thing you can control. But it is the one thing you can control. And it can help. So I've got another exercise that I'd like us to do. I'm going to set my timer for a minute. I'll tell you when we start and when we end. And what I invite you to do, without changing your breath, I'd like you to count how many breath cycles you take in the minute. Now, I know that just because I mentioned your breath, you're probably going to change it. That's fine. As I've said, this is not a competition. There's no right or wrong. We're staying curious about how are you arriving right now by looking at your breath, because the breath gives us a lot of information around our well-being, right? So 1 exhale and 1 inhale is a breath cycle. So starting in 3, 2, 1. Bring your awareness to your breath and count how many breath cycles you take over the next minute. It may help to soften your gaze or close your eyes only if you're comfortable to do. And if your mind has wandered, that's all right. Without judgment or criticism, gently bring it back to your breath. And that's a minute. That's a minute. Is anybody happy to share how many breath cycles you took?
17.
17? 5?
12.
12?
12.
12? 7? At the back? Are you breathing? Just checking. Great. So there's already quite a range in the room, right? Let's start with why. You know, Simon Sinek, once you have a why, you always find a how. He's the author of Start with Why. Why would I ask you to take a moment and be curious about your breath? Because the breath, as we know, is controlled, fortunately, by the autonomic nervous system. We don't need to think about that. There's enough to think about. However, when we consciously think about the breath, we can shift where the focus is. And when we are feeling stressed, because of what happens from the brain to the adrenal glands with adrenaline, you know this a whole lot better than I do, the cardiovascular system is brought into play fast, right? The heart beats, heart rate goes up to get the blood flow going, to get oxygen to prepare us to fight or flight. So the breath will change. And when we are taking fast, shallow breaths, and we stay in a stressful situation, it is possible to get pulled even more into that stress cycle. What is the one thing that you would tell a patient or yourself or somebody that you care about if you were feeling quite stressed? Slow down, breathe slowly. When we slow down the breath and breathe more deeper and slower, the parasympathetic nervous system starts to get more attention rather than the sympathetic nervous system. We can potentially reduce that sense of panic, anxiety, fight or flight response. So, knowing that, and there's now some research to show that ideally, if you want to stay in a state of heart coherence, so if you want to keep your heart rate variability consistent, if you want to keep your balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system quite good, reduce the sense of fight or flight. Does anybody know what the ideal range of taking breaths in a minute is? Think single digits, so somewhere between 6 to 8. So 5 is incredibly slow, deep, and you look. I was going to ask if you actually practice. Do you do mindfulness or meditation or breath work? Yeah, because that's very. I don't often get people in the room that have single-digit breaths. I often have close to 30, sometimes with the CEOs and stressed out executives that I work with. So knowing that, if you were breathing 17 or 12 or even 9 or 10, is now that you're aware of your breath, could you perhaps over our time together up until lunch, every now and again, I might remind you another one time, is bring your attention to your breath. Breathe a little bit deeper if you can on your inhale, breathing, using up your full diaphragm, your full lung capacity. And when you exhale, rather than just go, is to really let it out slower. Because we know, and we've got the science, this stuff used to be maybe woo-woo, but now we can really measure this, that you can shift brainwave activity very quickly. You can release oxytocin instead of adrenaline, which mitigates the effect of stress hormones within 2 or 3 slow, nourishing breaths. So breathing is another go-to technique that I really feel is quite helpful. And sometimes when you don't know what to do, just thinking about taking your next breath can be a very good survival strategy, because back to those circles of concern, influence, control, the one thing we can control is our breath. And when we are in the stress response, I was brought up in South Africa, and I have literally had wild animals chase, well, not me, but me in a car with my family, because we would go to the Kruger National Park. Anybody been to South Africa before on safari? Yeah, so we would go, and my father, we didn't have cell phone with cameras back then. It was those old-fashioned cameras. You'd have to get quite close to whatever it was that you were photographing. And my dad would get too close to either lions or elephants. So we'd be chased. And I can tell you that puts you into the fight or flight very quickly. Heart rate goes up, and all the things that happens with that. So nowadays, you may not be attacked by a wild animal, but we've got so much stimulus coming in at us. And when you're doing the work that you have chosen to do, that kind of environment, A&E, hospital, any kind of those kind of engagements, I mean, it's, I would say, catastrophic emotional burden. And so there's a huge amount of stress coming at you. So a lot of what I'm going to share, as I've mentioned before, I'd like you to think about how can I potentially practice this in spaces where I'm not in that fight or flight response. so that when I need to, I've got the practice and I can maybe tap into that. What we also know with COVID and the amount of stress that the healthcare system, that the NHS is under, we've seen that as a reflection of today. It's taken you 3 years to pull this together. And potentially there's a lot of your colleagues that aren't here for maybe reasons of just exhaustion and burnout and cynicism. So it's really okay to not be okay. I think what's really important is to be curious about what's happening and to ideally not wait until the whole match is burnt out, when the fire is completely gone, because then we know, as you've shared, thank you, recovery can be a whole lot longer. And there's this collective, Esther Perel, who is a specialist in communication and relationships, speaks about empathic resonance. So the fact that we're here together in the room, I always believe that the right people are in the right place at the right time. So there's a sense of connectedness that we can share. And even if we don't solve any problems, we're not going to be able to potentially influence or change the system. We're here together. And so we can have a moment of respite. One of the last times I was in South Africa, I took this photograph. Has anybody been to Cape Town? Yeah, I was between Franschhoek and Stellenbosch in a place called Johannesdal. And why I like the photo is for two reasons. My family are from the Champagne region in France. So I've grown up with champagne and wine as a big part of my lifestyle. Not always drinking it. I mean, yes, my family do drink it, but also the understanding of the alchemy of winemaking, which I find fascinating. It's a beautiful mix of things. So when I was driving past this vineyard, which was not for champagne, it was for called Cup Classique, because you know that the French are a bit funny about you using champagne. It's not from the region of Champagne. And in South Africa, they make really good champagne, but it can't be called champagne. Anyway, what I noticed, as you can on the photo see, are the roses at the end of each of the row of vines. Does anybody know why they're there? Because they look beautiful, and like your flowers. I do that for myself too, not often enough. Aphids, yeah. So they're there as an alarm system. So the roses will get affected by a certain aphid before the vine does. So the vineyard manager can pay, or should pay attention if something goes wrong with the roses, because if not, the cost of losing the whole crop is enormous. So my question to you is, do you know what your roses are, your red flags? When do you know that your front line of defense is starting to be a bit perforated, that if you ignore, potentially you could lose the whole crop? And if we stay curious about this, we can potentially avoid having to make big adjustments and rather just tweak things. Because burnout is a reality. The definition of burnout, which you may have come across from the World Health Organization, defines 3 things: ineffectiveness, cynicism, and exhaustion. And when those 3 things come together, so ineffectiveness is when you feel like your ability to get work done is less than before. It's almost a sense of like everything, nothing you do really makes a difference. And then in terms of cynicism, which relates to our emotional well-being, we start feeling cut off. We don't get joy from things that used to give us joy. And I think you also start getting to a point where you just cared too much, beyond compassion fatigue. And then you have this exhaustion, which is not alleviated by one good night's rest. It's a deep, deep in your bone kind of exhaustion. So we know this is the issue. After I worked with burnout a lot and I looked through the definition many times in various questionnaires, I realized that the letters make up the ICE, which I thought was interesting because ICE is a good remedy for burnout, right? If something's burning and hot, we put ice on it. ICE also stands for in case of emergency. And what I understand about neuroscience, because I'm fascinated by neuroscience, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I read about it, and I've actually just finished a course with Dr. Linda Shaw, which was fascinating. And we change most when we feel good, not bad. And most of us will move towards positivity rather than away from negativity. So I'm not going to talk about ineffectiveness, cynicism, and exhaustion, because we know, and many of us, is anybody feeling 1 or 2, maybe all 3 of those things at some times? Yeah. I'd like us to look at what do we need to move towards? What can be lights at the end of the tunnel, or a sun coming up over the horizon that we can be pulled rather than run away from? So instead of ineffectiveness, I'd like to speak about inspiration. At a basic level, inspiration is what we just did. Breathing in. How is your breath? Because I haven't spoken about breath for the last 5 minutes. Did you just forget about it? Potentially. So if this is the one thing you do or take from today, how is my breath? How am I inspiring? How can I breathe in more? That is a great physiological, physical way to start to help manage your sense of burnout and exhaustion and drainage. Then inspiration can also be mental, right? Like, what is inspiring in your life at the moment? Are you maybe quilting a blanket? Are you learning a new hobby? Are you trying to play a trumpet? Because I actually think I might get a trumpet. I just don't think my neighbor's going to appreciate it. So, but I realize how playing a new musical instrument can be quite interesting. I mean, he didn't even read music before COVID happened. So I feel quite inspired that somebody during that time has got to a point where they can read music and actually play a good tune. Then instead of cynicism, I'd like us to think about how can we stay curious about things? How can you be curious about creating more ease, more aliveness, more joy, being more well when it comes to your well-being? And really important, instead of just focusing on how do I get more energy or stop this exhaustion, is to think about a concept, another principle of well-being that I call effervescence. What does effervescence mean to you? If I say the word, what do you think of? Fizzy, bubbly. Baraka, that's cool. Okay. So generally, effervescence means lightness, and you can even see by our emotions, it's upliftment. And I feel that effervescence is almost the opposite of exhaustion. So effervescence, I don't think of Baraka, I think of champagne. But I'm biased because my parents met in 1964 in the Champagne countryside villages. It was called Ossé de Trois. They met, they fell in love, they got married in 1968, they saved some money, and then they went on honeymoon in 1969 to South Africa to go on safaris. And they stayed in South Africa for 53 years. Sure, feeling quite emotional because they left South Africa yesterday. They've come back to France. They were going to do that before COVID, but as we know, all of us had plans that were a bit deviated. And I learned a lot about facing their mortality because they both got very sick and I couldn't get to South Africa. It was on the red zone. It's just, we've all got those stories, right? I learned a lot about my own, how do I practice what I preach? That was one of my moments, the second time that I had really what for me, I would consider burnout was when my flight was canceled 48 hours again, the 6th of January, 2021. And I was exhausted. I had seasonal affective disorder. I just moved home. My dog had died. My parents were sick. And I had to put what I'm teaching you into practice. This stuff works. And if you don't know what to do, then all you do is you take a slow, deep breath, you inspire, that's good enough. And then slowly from there, breath by breath, you can work towards using more tools. But those tools have to be in your toolkit, right? So that when the accident happens, you've got them. And that's what today's about. And one of the tools is this idea of effervescence. Now, so my parents are in South Africa. They decided to stay. And we often had champagne, often. Just what we drink. You know, I guess in Yorkshire you have
tea.
Well, I was going to say, which one? I think Fiji. No.
I don't think it's all.
Oh, yeah, of course you can. Caffeine free. So I would grow up and my parents would stack glasses like this, like you saw in the Gatsby film, and they would pour the champagne into the top glass. It would overflow and fill the others. And by the way, the glasses were always stacked on a tray, and then my mom would drink what was filled up the tray. So there's no wastage. You can actually see here, I've got 2 photographs. That's me on my first birthday back in France. It does look like my mother's giving me champagne, right? Yeah. She says she wasn't. She was letting the bubbles pop on my nose. I mean, you can understand why I'm so enthralled by bubbly. But here, sadly, the photo was cut off there, but that's the top glass on a short tower. And this is one about, I don't know, 10 years later, my dad's birthday in our living room at home, and you can see the champagne glasses. And for me, it is such a beautiful analogy of contagious effervescence. So if you're at the top of the tower, which you often are, when you're with a patient, they're looking up to you. When you're at home as a parent, when you're with your friends, when you have enough effervescence to overflow, you can potentially fill others. However, a lot of us, I know, we wouldn't have this conference if we weren't feeling quite flat, the opposite of effervescence. So how do we make sure that you stay effervescent for yourself to feel fizzy, bubbly, uplifted like Baraka, but Also, because we know that effervescence is contagious. And if you can impact one patient's life and potentially help them in that one shift, you've done a great job. But you can't do that if you don't have it within yourself. So let's look at how we put this into practice. So when we look at champagne making, wine making, we need all the seasons. We can't just have spring and summer. We need winter when the vines, actually, this is when the vines get stronger. In the winter, when they actually die off and close down, their roots have to go really deep. And the deeper their roots, the stronger the vine is when the spring and the summer comes for the harvest. So we've been through and will continue to go through winter in a symbolic sense. And we can learn a lot about our resilience during those times. And I find that using the seasons is a lovely way to look at your daily routine and the things you can do and when you can make these work. Does anybody know the song from Crowded House? Am I giving away my age? 4 Seasons in 1 Day. I'm not going to try to sing it because of this like husky thing going. But if you think of the 4 seasons, spring, summer, autumn, winter, and you overlap it as an analogy onto a 24-hour day, spring would be, now I know that when you're working shifts, your days can be upside down, but let's look at it as generally we'll wake up and it's the morning, like today. So when you wake up, the moment you become conscious, that is spring. Then the moment you actually do something that might trigger the stress response, that becomes summer. So you engage with the outside world through social media, news, you pick up email, you get to the ward, anything that might get you feeling like you need to produce adrenaline, cortisol. Then we have the end of our day where things start to wind down, where just like in nature, we need the seasons to slowly shift. The temperature drops, the days get shorter, the nights get longer, and then we have winter. And this is where you get into bed, put your head on the pillow, and hopefully sleep for 7 to 9 hours. When was the last time you had a good night's sleep? Okay, we're going to talk about that. So let's start at the beginning. If you think of when you become conscious, so this is your waking time. And just like spring, sometimes there's morning fog and it takes a bit of time to clear. When you wake up in the morning, would you agree that your nervous system is probably at its most calm or balanced that it's going to be for the day? Because you've been resting, even if you've had maybe crazy dreams or you've been a bit restless, you've been horizontal, you haven't been faced with a lot of maybe work issues and trauma and stress, so you're probably the most relaxed you're going to be. So could you linger as long as possible in that state when your body's in a bit more of homeostasis? So just a question to be curious about. And when you're waking up, are you giving yourself time to check in with yourself, or are you potentially just immediately reaching for your phone? Is this your alarm clock? And when it wakes you up, are there maybe 17 WhatsApps and messages? And do you then immediately go into that before you've maybe even gone to the bathroom? And the question why I ask this is, you will immediately start to drain emotional, physical, and mental energy when you do that. And there's a lady called Brene Brown. Has anybody come across her? She's a researcher. She's done a TED Talk. She writes a lot about emotional resilience. And she speaks about this concept of we armor ourselves. And absolutely, as doctors and health practitioners, when we're in front of patients, it's not about you. So you might be feeling tired, exhausted, cynical, but you'll need to put on a mask, so to speak, in order to show up in a certain way. And that takes extra energy. So that our energy battery, we wake up with this balanced nervous system that's quite full of energy, and then it starts to drop. I have found that poetry, especially through COVID, has been something that has helped me. So quilting has helped you. I found poetry quite helpful. And I found this beautiful poem about that time in the morning when we wake up by Stephen Barzer. When we awaken, there is a moment before we remember the burdens we bear. That yesterday we lost or won a fortune or a battle or a love. Or that today we must go to work or to court or to hospital. Before we start piecing together who we will be, and in that moment, we are simply consciousness. I like the way we are in that naked moment before we are defined, in that briefest moment before we don ourselves. So before we put on potentially these masks. So I don't know what your personal circumstances are like. You might have Oscar jumping onto the bed to wake you up. You might be waking up with your alarm. You may not be able to sleep. So you're already awake. But what I'd like you to think about is that time of day. Is there a way that you could do something for your well-being, even if it is as simple as taking 3 deep breaths in bed before you get up? I'm not talking about big dramatic things. I'm not saying get up and do a HIIT session for half an hour and go running 5 miles. I mean, if you want to do that, amazing, as long as that's consistent, right? Consistency over intensity. And if you're thinking, I just don't have the time, I wake up at the last minute, I've got so much to do, is to remember to stay a little bit curious and keep your imagination open. Anybody got young kids? How young? 3. Okay, so like, you know, somewhere between the age of 3 and 10, kids can like turn themselves around and become a sheriff. Then they can turn the other way and become like an astronaut or a doctor. I mean, most kids want to be doctors, right? So imagination is an incredible thing. And we as adults tend to lose it, right? We don't have time for that, or it seems frivolous. I'm inviting you to let your imagination flow. And something may come and something may not. When I've done this exercise, I'll share with you recently what happened. Myself, when COVID happened, I was in central London and I had to get out. I was just like, after the first lockdown, I was like, I can't stay, I can't afford the rent. It was like, as a professional speaker, there was no speaking engagement. So I left and I moved to Farnham in Surrey. And when I moved, I had to make such a quick decision because I couldn't even see the property. Nobody was viewing things. And I had no idea how busy the road was that I was going to live on. So I moved to Farnham. Great, I'm outside of London, I've got a bit more space. There's a big forest close by called the Bourne Woods. However, as things started to pick up pace, the road, Fir Grove Hill, became like a main entryway into Farnham. And I'm noise sensitive. So in the mornings, I'd wake up to traffic. And when I ask this question, the one I'm about to ask you in a moment, is what, if anything were possible, how would you start your day? I asked myself the question, if anything were possible, how would I start my day? I'd be like, well, I don't want to hear a car, I just want to hear bird song. So what I did for the last 3 months, because I've now moved out of Farnham, took me a year and a half that I've managed to move. I'm in Chichester 2 months ago, and I do hear birds now, less traffic. But for those like 6 months, I thought to myself, I can play bird music. So I found funky music on YouTube. So when I would wake up, I downloaded it so I didn't have to put my phone off flight mode. So I wouldn't see all the WhatsApps. Then for the first 15 minutes, half an hour, maybe an hour, I'd have birds going. It's not the real thing. There weren't actual swallows and birds outside, but somehow it made me feel like I was in control of something that concerned me. Another thing, when I asked a client of mine, what would you do? He said to me, oh, if I could do anything in the morning, I would go to the moon. Because I said to him, like, nothing's constraining, nothing. He said, I'd go to the moon. I said, oh, isn't that interesting? Why? And he said, because I like the idea of being away and getting perspective and absolute silence. So from that conversation, we realized that he had a hill that he could walk to once a week. It wasn't far from his home. He couldn't do it every day. Once a week, he would go walk to the hill. That would give him perspective because he would see the outlook over the village and some quiet. And he called that his moon walk. So it became it was symbolic of something bigger. And he always felt much more rested and had a bigger picture after doing his moon walk. So what's your moon walk? I'd like you to take a minute or two and maybe turn to the person closest to you or behind you if you'd like. And if something comes up, share. And if not, nothing. But if anything were possible, you were a 10-year-old version of you, and you could do anything in those first few moments that you woke up in the morning, what would that be? Because maybe from your imagination, like hearing birds chirp or going to the moon, you might think of, oh, I could play some bird chirping music or go for a walk once a week. So I'll give us 2 minutes to do this exercise and let's share. If you're happy to. Great. That is a minute, 2 minutes, I mean. Anybody have an idea, Papa? Keen to share it? Just a thumbs up? Got a few smiles? Okay. Okay. Okay, so maybe that's something that you could leave with today, because once we get pulled into our work day, once we're in this, our working shift, I mean, we have no idea what's going to come at us, right? You certainly can't predict that. And so, can I ask, is there anybody that spends a large amount of time sitting behind a screen? Ever? Okay, I didn't want to assume that everybody was on their feet, because I know that my one friend who's a GP spends a lot of her time just getting through like 100 patients a day, calling back from the practice. So these are things, if you're sitting behind a screen for the whole day, these are 3 ways that you can potentially recharge your energy. And maybe you're doing these already, but perhaps not. I call these, the first one is the 20-20-20 guideline. So every 20 minutes to look 20 feet away from your screen for 20 seconds. So give yourself a bit of an eye strain break. And even if you just do it once or twice in an hour, you're not getting up from the chair, you're not stopping what you're doing, but you're giving yourself a reminder that there's a big picture going on. And then absolutely, if you sit still for longer than an hour at a time, we know that ergonomically, you're probably compromising your posture, leaning forward. If you're like me, you would cross your legs. That constricts your thoracic cavity, so you don't breathe as deeply. You create tension, neck ache, jaw ache, headaches. So getting up and stretching, even if it is simply standing up from your chair, like I give you permission right now, we've been sitting for about an hour. So I invite you, if you'd like to just stand. And I'll keep talking. We're not going to adjourn the meeting, but stand. If you want to stretch a bit, great. I sometimes shake out my legs. Yeah, because motion shifts emotion. And when we're very stressed and tired, sometimes just doing this and giving yourself permission to get up and yawn is wonderful, because that means that you're breathing, and then take a seat again. Notice if you feel any different. It's incredible. I can just see white teeth. We love to move, but often we don't. And even if we are moving, so if you're on your feet all day, perhaps in A&E, you can also still be tense, right? And constricted. And I'll show you this fascinating research that I found. I should maybe share the link. It was a really good webinar for doctors that give you anesthetics are called. And thank you. My synapses when I was thinking anesthetics. No. So this was specifically targeted at them, but they're not the only ones who are tired, right? Yeah. And this was fascinating that they took a look where surgeons had what they call a micro break. So the one piece of research was 90 seconds. 90 seconds. We're not talking about a half an hour lunch break yet. 90-second breaks. And they had all these benefits: reduced pain, especially in the back, better technique, fewer intraoperative events, reduced fatigue, and very importantly, the procedures did not take longer to complete. So sometimes the most productive thing we can do is actually to do nothing, to stop. So back to the slide before, mentioning those 3 things. So the simple eye break, stretching we just did 20 seconds. We didn't even do a minute. And the research has shown that 90-second breaks can make a big difference in terms of your productivity. And I know this isn't always possible, but when it is, so when it's controllable, could you gift yourself a break where you nourish yourself, drink and eat? And if there are days where you can't, don't focus on those. Start with what you can. So I think it was Theodore Roosevelt who said, do what you can with where you are and what you have. And during your day, if you've practiced things like we did that mindful minutes, if you've practiced relaxing your body while you're driving, while you're standing in queues, while you're with your kids, while you're cooking in the kitchen, when it really matters the most, you're more likely to default to that. If you haven't practiced it, if you never do the mindful minutes and count your breaths or try different breathing techniques, you're not going to potentially use that tool because it's not going to be in your toolkit. And a very powerful technique that I use a lot is called the ABC technique. Awareness, breathing, and care. Has anybody come across this? So awareness is simply being aware of your body, because often we can be quite disembodied. We spend our days in our heads, and that's why we ignore the fact that we need to go to the toilet or even eat, let alone connect with our emotions and whether our bodies are feeling a bit stressed or tense. So just being aware, how is my body in this moment? Like right now, if you notice your shoulders, what would it be like if you let them drop just a little bit towards the ground? What if you let your jaw relax? Maybe let your tongue drop. Like you may not even realize that you're actually quite tense until you give yourself an opportunity to feel the awareness of what's it like if I'm not that tense. And then your breathing is such a valuable tool to help you reduce the effect of stress. And then the C stands for care. Can you, in this moment, think about someone or something that you care about, or a pet? So have you got someone that you care about, or something, or a place that makes you feel happy? Maybe it's someone you love, maybe it's something that you really like or enjoy. And hold that thought in your mind, because thoughts trigger neurochemicals that then trigger a hormonal release, that then trigger a feeling and a mood and emotion. And when you give yourself time to think about things that you care about, you shift your internal chemistry compared to when you don't. So this is I've spent sometimes half a day teaching this one technique. So if you're interested in knowing more about it, I can share a YouTube video where Mark Walsh, who teaches this specifically to frontline workers, how you can embed this. And the more you practice it, the easier it becomes. So moving on, once we've had our summer day, and hopefully you've found ways to keep breathing, to stay less tense in your body, maybe even to have micro breaks, we get to some point in our day where we need to slow down, wind down. And this is where a lot of us go wrong. I guess we might commute, we come home, and we don't have rituals, especially after COVID, that help us realize that we are transitioning to another time of day. And when our buckets at work get so full of stress and trauma, and if we don't empty that, then small things in our private lives can actually push us over the edge. Have you had that where you snap and take it out on the person or the people that you care about the most? And it's not about them. It's potentially about the fact that you're just full, right? So what kind of techniques have you got to release that? And this is very personal. I mean, I know what works for me is at the end of my workday, as a symbol of winding down, I always change my outfit. I sometimes go and wash my hands. It's not that they're dirty. I literally go, in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm washing off the day. Or I'll go for a brisk walk if I'm able to do that. I've got a client that goes and sits in her car and listens to the radio for 10 minutes. Because she used to drive to and from her place of work. And now that she's working from home a lot, she finds that doing that is a very powerful ritual, even though she doesn't have to drive. So remember what I said about imagination? We are in extraordinary times, and extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. So it's a good idea to think about what is potentially possible that could help me. And this means that we've got to be quite clear on our boundaries. So I spoke about in France, they're very clear about the boundaries of champagne and where the vines are that you can use to make it. And you can't call it champagne if it doesn't come from there. Then it's a cava, or it's a Prosecco, or it's a Cup Classique. What are your boundaries to make sure that you stay effervescent, that you feel inspired, that you can stay curious. And those boundaries might change. They may change depending on what shifts you're working, what rota you're on, the time of year, but you cannot consciously change anything that you're not conscious and aware of in the first place. And that's why awareness and curiosity are so key to well-being. Even if you don't do anything differently, if you just stay curious about your well-being, that can help. And we need to look after ourselves. Because I mean, after speaking with Sam, and actually when I first went through burnout myself, when I went through a divorce, I left a very conservative Christian community, I left a country. I would not have done that without my GP. And her name was Sam, which I forgot about until today, Dr. Sam Feely. I was like, wow, Dr. Sam's a good, you know? And she had her own experience. And I remember seeing her every morning. She would run through our neighborhood. And I was like, you're walking your talk. And so when she took me through the process of dealing with what I had experienced, I really took her word for it. So your patients will feed off you. You can tell them what to do, but, and I know not all your patients will see your actions, but the way you show up, that sense of effervescence and presence can come across. In the neuroscience course that I just finished, we can actually influence people's behavior. So when you're speaking to patients, they pick up on all your nonverbal cues, right? A lot more than your words. So when you're feeling potentially calm and good and grounded, if you're in heart coherence, because we know that when your heart is coherent, you give off like a different electromagnetic field, you can impact them. So that's also another way to think about when I'm looking after myself and I've got these boundaries, like what is enough and when is exhaustion not worth it? And that takes courage. This is not easy to say no, to stop, to ask for help, to use the resources that are available to you. It really is important. And from a personal story, my grandfather, my mother's father, worked for the SNCF, the Société Générale de Chemin de Fer in France, the national railway, and strong work ethic in our family. And he worked a double shift, went home, was sleeping, and was told that a friend didn't arrive and could he help? Like most of you in the room, you'd probably say yes. He went, made a mistake, and was crushed and didn't come home, leaving my mother with 6 siblings and a mother on her own. And that story I only found out recently because I struggle with insomnia and sleep, and I've got the strong work ethic and I love what I do. And when we love what we do, it's not work, right? And it becomes hard to say no and look after ourselves. And I remember my grandfather, and I'm like, maybe if he had said no and put himself first, he would have done a lot more shifts, you know? So when you're feeling tired, I'd like you to think about how you can take your tired heart and turn it into art. And when I say turn it into art, I don't literally mean create a Picasso painting, but I mean find things that inspire you and make you feel a sense of effervescence, like the flowers, like the quilting. For me, it was cooking again. So during COVID, I ordered once a week. I got a box delivered from Mindful Chef with all the ingredients, and because I was starting to eat a whole lot of carrot cake, which is not cool for a dietitian. Does anybody else have strange cravings? Or do you have strange cravings when you're stressed out? Because cortisol drives sugar and carbohydrates, and like we just crave those things. So I was like, no, if I get the box of good things, then I've got like 2 or 3 meals I can prepare for myself. And I also used to put flowers in the kitchen, which I forgot about. So I'm going to do that. So find things like poetry works for me. Music is something I'm starting to use. Does anybody else use music or poetry? Does anybody do creative art of any kind? Like drawing, doodling? Something I did try, jigsaw puzzles in winter. Because when we're feeling very stressed, it's quite helpful to get out of your head and into your body and do something with your hands. And when you're incredibly stressed, it's helpful to do repetitive motions with hands. So I've got some friends that have taken up knitting, gardening, redecorated, and it's easy to know these things, but are you doing them? And if you're not, could you be curious about, wow, what's that? Maybe something new that I could try that could maybe help me through this year and the months that are going to come and help me feel wholehearted. So one of my favorite poets, David Whyte, is an Irish poet and philosopher. He says that the antidote to exhaustion isn't rest, it's wholeheartedness. When we feel like we've got a joyful heart, then things are much easier. It's like when we have energy, we can move mountains. It's when we don't have energy that everything just feels like a huge mountain, right? So I'd like you to think about, if anything were possible, what could your autumn look like if you were to wind down using creativity or hobbies or exercise or music? And I'm not going to ask you to share this, but I'd like you just to take a deep breath in your own pace, in your own time. And as you inspire your lungs, to think about, if anything were possible, how could I end my day? How could I start to wind down? Because if you don't wind down, it's like going at 70 or 90 miles an hour, and then you get into bed, and then you expect your whole system to just stop. But you're tired and wired, and that doesn't make for a good recipe for sleep, right? How is everybody doing in terms of sleep? Who's like really good? Like you're getting enough, you're waking up rested and well and energized? No, okay. Have you, by the way, what do you call going to sleep? My parents used to say dodo time. Some of us say getting shut eye. Some of us say hit the sack. Is it, I don't know, in Yorkshire? Bedtime.
Up the hill to Bedfordshire.
Up the hill to Bedfordshire.
Yeah, that's what my parents used to say.
I like that.
Yeah, oh, is it? There you go.
Also a poem, okay. The one thing we know around well-being is most of us, most of humanity, not just doctors, but certainly doctors, are not getting enough shut eye. That's another term. And I'm hoping, have you listened to this 19-minute TED Talk? Because if you haven't, it's a good place to start.
I think it was on my suggested for around 10 o'clock when I was trying to get to sleep.
When you were trying to get to sleep. What were you doing on your phone at 10 o'clock?
I was finding
Right.
something to listen to.
Okay, great. So Matthew Walker is a researcher and a doctor, and he specializes in helping people understand and be able to get more sleep. So, I mean, his book is great, but it's a huge, big read. You can maybe, if you're interested, listen to his podcast interviews or just watch his 19-minute TED Talk sometime. Generally, though, even if you are a doctor, we're not superhuman. We need sleep. We need to sleep a third of our lives. Some of us are different in how we get that sleep. Like some of us sometimes sleep for, I don't know, about 4 hours and find that we wake up and then go back to sleep again. But generally, most of us, to function well, need somewhere between 7 and 9 hours of sleep. And I know that that's not always easy to get. I suffer from insomnia. I actually got quite addicted to sleeping pills, and Sam helped me with that, because in South Africa, they weren't that regulated about giving them out, you know, and they were highly addictive. And so what can help is not just sleep, but learning how to rest in bite-sized chunks. So we need to learn how to be able to get away from all this light and stimulus and stress. And when I think of hospitals and GP practices and just life in general, it's also bright. Like the visual cortex gets so much stimulus. And then when we get to bed, when we get into that winter season, we end up potentially keeping the lights on. So we know that light reduces melatonin in the brain, which we need to be able to feel drowsy and sleepy. So thinking about, you can't always change what's happening in your day. You can potentially decide and control what happens in that hour or so before you go to bed and sleep. And if you are spending time online, pay attention to what you're spending time looking at. If it's stuff to sleep, amazing. But if it's just aimlessly scrolling, we know how that can keep the mind going. So that monkey mind keeps on jumping around from branch to branch, and then you can't actually rest. And when I say practicing for sleep, because when we get into bed, if you've been go, go, go from the moment you've opened your eyes and you become conscious, it is really difficult for many of us to just surrender into rest and deep sleep. So how could you be more strategic about rest? Like doing a mindful minute, even just once a day, taking a midday break, giving yourself an opportunity to take a deep breath in between tasks. Because when you give yourself permission to rest during the day, it makes it easier when you get to the end of the day to act. Your body's like, your nervous system is like, okay, I've rested because I took a 3-minute lunch break, or I took 3 deep breaths when I went to the bathroom, or I stopped and had a cup of tea, but didn't stay on my phone. So an opportunity to pair and share for 2 minutes before we move on. I'd like you to reflect on, because now we've been through the 4 seasons, spring, summer, autumn, winter. Which season, and by that I mean which time of day, so the start of your day, during your work day, that time when you're transitioning after work into when you go into bed? Or is it winter when you're actually in bed, where we need to think about things like lighting and the darker the room, the better. The temperature is important. If I don't have earplugs in, I don't sleep. And I didn't know that until I read a book on sleep. I was like, yeah, let me try earplugs. Now I found the perfect ones and they make me feel like I'm in a cocoon. So staying open to what are new things you could try to help you improve your quality of sleep. But I'd like you to take a moment and share, if you were to choose one of the seasons, which time of day do you want to be stronger in? Which one do you feel that you need more rest in? And is there something that's come up for you today so far that you could put into practice? So take a minute each, so a couple of minutes to share what's coming up for you, and then we'll move on. Great. Great, great. Just helping you distill to your one thing, right? So we've covered quite a bit of ground. And the tool that I developed in 2006 when I first started doing group work and taking health principles around well-being and put them in a practical, usable toolkit is I designed the Wellculator, which is kind of like a calculation of how well you are in terms of your well-being habits. And we've worked through, so there's 10 areas on the Wellculator that are important to help sustain good physical well-being. And we've been through quite a few of them already. I'm just going to briefly go through the rest. And then I'd like us to score ourselves so that before we go into lunch, you have an idea of what is your Wellculator score and what is one thing that you could do to help you improve that. And you can always come back to it. So the first point on the Wellculator is around your strategy, around the way that you feed yourself. So what I mean by this is, have you got a plan around the way that you eat and drink that helps to sustain your energy most of the time, 80% of the time? You don't have to do this all the time, but most of the time do you? Because when you don't, this is what happens a lot, right? We wake up in the morning, there's morning mayhem, we rush, we get pulled in all different types of directions, we probably skip breakfast, we have back-to-back cups of coffee. If we get a chance to stop, we can barely manage to go to the bathroom and to eat, and we're on our phones, so we don't really stop. And then come the afternoon, we feel like a snack potentially to lift our energy, so we look for something sweet, something salty. By the time we get home, it's super late, and we're so starving, so famished, we either buy a quick ready-made meal or takeaway, or eat more than we need, and maybe there's wine and chocolate that bookends that. Can anybody resonate with any of this? Okay, a lot. So this is not going to help us sustain our blood glucose levels, which is not going to help us manage stress and all that stuff. So ideally, this is what a good strategy would look like. But I know that it's not always possible to do all of this. So even if you think of one strategy, so if you are eating, can you notice the difference in color on this slide compared to the one before? The one before was quite beige, right? So that's my top principle around food, is can you bring in more color? And by color, I don't mean M&Ms and Skittles and cold drinks and crisps. I mean nature's colorful produce, because color gives us fiber and micronutrients. And then there's a whole different conversation that we're not going to have today around gut health. So I'm very interested in epigenetics and how nutrition impacts our genetic expression, and gut health is a big part of that. So we know we can drive inflammation or reduce it depending on what we put into our gut. And generally high fiber, colorful foods give us antioxidants, vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients that are good for our system. Another thing that's important when your energy drops is to ask yourself if you're hydrated. We need about a glass of water for every 10 kilograms that we weigh. So if you weigh 100, you need maybe 10 glasses. If you weigh 60, you need less, but most of it will not. And I know it's not always practical because you don't always want to rush to the bathroom. When you can though, are you drinking enough water? Because when you don't, you'll feel tired, maybe have a headache, and feel what I call hangry, irritable and hungry. Also, another food group is nature. We know that we can experience, like I have, seasonal affective disorder if you don't have enough vitamin D, exposure to fresh air. And in this kind of industry and the work that we do, it can be so easy to like leave home in the dark, stay indoors, get back home in the dark. And that's why not just trying to get out into nature as often as possible, but at the very minimum, paying attention to your breathing. Because if you don't have enough oxygen in your system, you can't feel effervescent. And when you do this right, it makes it easier at the end of the day to make better choices potentially, or to not finish the whole bag of crisps or the whole slab of chocolates while you're watching Netflix or just browsing online. So these are parts of the well curated that are important. Strategically refueling, eating like an artist, so bringing in foods that can support our gut health, being mindful around how we are, that's the awareness that I spoke about, thinking about hydration, paying attention to your health numbers. So I know that you check the potassium potentially of patients, but what about you? I had fatigue for months and I thought I had iron deficiency anemia, didn't have that. And eventually through a simple blood test, I picked up that I have megaloblastic anemia. Easily solved by the right B vitamins. Yeah, and now that I've done genetic testing, I've got a genetic predisposition to needing loads more folate and magnesium. So when I don't take magnesium, I get a cramp in my muscles. So we've got to check these things, right? I always tell my clients, and you know this about your patients, we've got to know basics like blood pressure and cholesterol. But what about you? Because if you can pick up things before they get too wrong, you can save yourself a lot of resources and time and energy and money. And what's also important as we move on, which we've discussed, is having enough self-care and intentional rest and sleep. And that one topic I spent quite a bit of time on because I felt that that was quite important, and we looked at the seasons. What's also important that I've touched on through effervescence and curiosity is how can you cultivate a positive mindset, especially when things are there's so many reasons not to be positive. And these are two things that I do that maybe you could try. Does anybody have a gratitude practice where you express what you're grateful for, write things down? Because of all the areas in positive psychology, this is the one that's probably the most researched. So Martin Seligman started it, Dr. Sean Achor at Harvard, where they look at people, they take a few minutes every day to write down 3 things. Do you write down 3 things that you're grateful for?
I just think about them as I leave work.
You just think about them as you leave work. Great. So that can shift you towards becoming more biased to optimism. You can literally change the neural circuits in your brain. I mean, we know the brain is neuroplastic. So I started a gratitude journal 7 years ago. So this one, it's just these ones that you write 1 year a line. And now I'm on to year 2 in this one. When I'm having a bad day, I pick up one of these books and I remind myself about the life of thousands of gratitudes. I get goosebumps as I do this. I mean, it's my books. And because we forget the good and we get involved in the bad and what's all the wrong. And this has been the best antidepressant I've ever done. So maybe that's something you could do. If you think about it and that works for you, great. On a simple level, and you can access this on my website, I designed this. So it's basically 100 blocks, but I call it a 100-day celebration challenge. And you don't have to do it every day for 100 days, but in a year, I'll put this up in my home and I write down something I'm happy about. And whenever I walk past the chart, I'm like, oh, life's okay. So I don't know, for me, having visual cues, I find that quite helpful rather than getting caught up in my own head and space. And this is another TED talk that potentially you could watch. It's called Where Joy Hides and How to Find It. And Ingrid Fettel-Lee has done research into how you can create joy in the area around you, like having flowers in your kitchen. There are cheap, easy things that we can do that can make us feel a bit more joyful. And joy takes practice. It's like exercise. If you don't work at it, we can end up going the opposite side, which is more towards feeling down, anxiety, depression. And then we've spoken about how important it is to activate and move during your workday, especially thinking about stretching. We know that exercise is good for us. In some of the workshops I do, I speak about your window of tolerance and knowing when you need what kind of exercise. Because sometimes you feel so flat and exhausted, you're in the hyper-aroused state that you need something like a brisk walk or some water on your face or some upbeat music to lift you up. But sometimes you can be so hyper, and this is individual, depending on what you've experienced for the day, you can be quite in the fight response that you don't need a brisk walk or a run or jiving music. You need to lie down on the ground and ground yourself or listen to classical music. And being aware of what you need when is really important. And then lastly, we've spoken about this, is do you know and notice your body when it's in the stress response? Remember the roses, the red flags? So let's score ourselves. This is how I'd like you to do this. I'm going to remind you of each question. I'd like you to give yourself 1 point if you answer yes. I do that activity 80% of the time. You don't have to do it all the time, but most of the time. And if you answer no, no points. Are you able? And then I've got little handouts for you if you'd like to remember or to take it and do this with someone that you care about. So firstly, have you got a strategy around the way that you eat most of the time? So do you eat and drink in such a way that keeps your energy up 80% of the time? If it's yes, 1 point. If it's no, no point. Do you eat enough color? Enough is 8 to 10 servings of plant-based foods every day of the week. So you'll know instinctively. Go with your gut reaction. So if it's yes, 1 point. If it's no, no points. Do not panic if you do not have a point yet. Would you say that you're mindful? So are you aware of your body? So are you conscious of your breath? How tense you are on your shoulders? Are you conscious of taking those breaks that we spoke about? Yes or no? Do you hydrate enough? I'm not going to even talk about caffeine and alcohol and things, but are you drinking enough water most of the time? Yes or no? Do you know your health numbers? So are you tracking some of the big things that are important for your health and well-being? Are you getting enough rest? Let's just look at that. So most days of the week, are you waking up feeling rested? If it's yes, 1 point. If it's no, no points. Do you have ways to cultivate a positive mindset? So for me, the gratitude journal is one. I've got a few others like that. Isn't that interesting? There's many different techniques, but ideally, have you got one that you're doing without thinking? And then do you move and stretch during your workday? Are you doing the right kind of exercise? We know that we need, or the World Health Organization says, 30 minutes of walking most days of the week. But ideally, are you doing the right exercise at the right time? And then lastly, do you know when you're stressed? And have you got one technique that you can use to help reduce that stress response, such as deep breathing or perspective taking or helicopter view or relaxation or the ABC technique that we work through? Are you happy to share your score on the calculator today? Because it will change. What's your score out of 10? 3, 4, 1? Anybody? 3, 4? Okay. The average is generally 4-ish. So the message I want to share is, this isn't rocket science, right? We know this, but can we see how common knowledge isn't common practice? So how do we, because you can't go from a score of 1 or 3 or 10, even if your score is 9, and the one thing you answered no to is sleep, because you only get 3 hours of sleep a night. That's not good. So there's no competition here. The idea of the calculator is to make us aware of how can I build that base of that pyramid? Because if you're not getting these things right, it is so much harder to regulate your emotions and have good mental health. So what is one thing that you could take from what we've discussed today? So we've spoken about things that you can control. And a lot of these you can control. Maybe not all the time, but then choose the one that you feel motivated. Actually, I like the idea of cultivating a joy practice. Or I can go and watch that TED talk on sleep. What is one thing that you'd like to take from today? Because if you try and do more, you won't change. It's a bit like a doctor saying to the patient, the best thing you can do is give up smoking, drinking, and fried food. And the response is, what's the second best? We don't like to change. It's part of our cognitive biases. We get into a status quo, we get comfortable. So if you want to create change, and this is based on fascinating research done by a professor and Dr. B.J. Fogg at Stanford, if you want to change a behavior, you need to make that behavior so tiny that you have a 100% chance of doing it. So let's say you're actually quite dehydrated. You get an afternoon headache most of the time, and you're thinking, actually, of everything Celine spoke about today, I could maybe drink more water. So your goal is not to go from no water to 2 liters or 8 glasses. It's, I'm going to have 1 glass of water when I brush my teeth. So you attach the new behavior that is simple and small to something that you always do. Hopefully you brush your teeth. And that's the goal. You're going to have 1 glass of water when you brush your teeth, either in the morning or the afternoon. How are you going to feel when you have that glass of water? Good or bad? Probably good. But if you said, I'm going to have 8 glasses of water and you don't get to it, you're going to feel bad. You need to feel good. Feeling good is the most important part of behavior science. Behavior change, and the neuroscience shows that we change most when we feel good, not bad. So give yourself the ability to feel good about yourself. I took a mindful breath as I got into the car and touched the steering wheel. I did a mindful minute on a Monday. Like, that's the goal. Keep it small and tiny. Give it a place to exist. You've got to be clear where you're going to do it, when, with who. Because if it doesn't have a place to grow, it's like planting a seed and there's no water or soil. We need to give it place to actually grow. So on that note, as we wrap up, because I'm standing between you and a lovely vegan Thai curry, what is your personal pledge today? From our time together, and thank you for being here and being aware and curious and open-minded, what is something that you're going to take and do something about? Because remember, well-being is not about knowing, it's about doing. What is a tiny habit you're going to do? And I really want you to make it obvious and easy so that you feel good, ideally in the next 24 hours. Like, you've got to do this really quickly, because the sooner you act on something, the more you build the momentum. So last opportunity to share. I'd like you to share with each other. And when you listen, don't just think about your own idea. I'd like you to challenge the person if you feel that their tiny habit is not 100% doable for them. How can they make it super teeny tiny easy? So take a moment to share, what is your tiny pledge? Where and when will you do it? And then I'll share one last thought and we'll go to lunch. Great. So take a moment to do that. And that is thank you. Thank you. Is anybody happy to share? Perhaps not what you were told, but what your behavior changes. Yeah?
So I'm paranoid with my phone, being by the side of my bed. I was listening really guiltily when they were like at 10 o'clock, I try and go to sleep, and I'm thinking 1 o'clock. And then when I wake up, the first thing I do is turn my alarm off, which is my phone. So then the next thing I do is social media or checking the messages. I'm not going to say, but he's got a fantastic alarm clock. There's a sunrise and bird song. So my commitment is tonight I'm going to go away and I'm going to buy that so that I can ditch the phone as my alarm clock. So I'm not tempted and I can have that kind of spring, a nice spring. And it's going to especially help me because it's a sunrise one. So I do lots of different shifts that will help with the cortisol. So
yeah, I also invested in one, and in the winter months it helps me so much. Yeah, you can actually buy normal alarm clocks. One more share perhaps. Thank you. Maybe from the side of the room. What is your tiny pledge? That's it. The time in the car can be so valuable. We can just end up wasting it or using it as a very powerful, almost like a portal. That's wonderful. Yeah. Would you like to share something?
Just to remember ourselves as well.
I was hoping somebody said that moment between patients, because it is back to back, but there is a moment, right? Yeah. Where you can take a conscious deep breath. And how many patients are you seeing a day?
It is.
What's the minimum?
And it could be, or sometimes DNS, CNS, it could be 6
So I was going to say,
I'm saying one already, I just said,
you'll take at least 6 or 10 very deep breaths every day.
I'm just saying, it's a one shift, morning shift,
shift,
but I did it with 2, it will be double.
Wonderful. That is great. Great. Now, I can support you because when this is all you're going to take from today, no matter what your score is on the Worldculator. That's what's necessary. And over time, we can build up and then we end up doing like what you're doing, which is the impossible. I've got the Worldculator here as a card. You're welcome to take as many as you want. And if you can redo this with someone you care about, that's the best way to integrate learning. And I really find I've been using this Worldculator tool. I use it myself to double check things and it really helps. Another way I can support you is if you do email, I say it's weekly, but it's not really, it's probably twice a month. I send a little poem or a quote or an interesting article or something around well-being. I also do, I'm not a chef, but once a week I send a recipe out that's 5 ingredients or less, that's colorful. And I don't mind if you never cook any of my recipes. If you just think about your well-being in that moment and you're like, I can't remember her name and she was short and she had that nice accent, but we spoke about my well-being, like then Sam and I have done our job today, And if you would like some kind of celebration chart before you go buy yourself maybe a gratitude journal, that's available on my website too. You can download a PDF because having stuff tangibly to remind us makes things real. And then find me on social media. Ask me any questions. I'm going to hang around for lunch so we can have, you're not alone. We need more effervescent, inspired, curious doctors. But start with you first. It's not selfish at all. And thank you to all the work the two of you put together. I think this will be the first of many.
really bad that I scored 1 on the one that I think I scored the lowest, but I think that was because I was being so honest about what I do and don't do. And you know what? I just found I'm so effervescent, even though I scored 1, because I feel really inspired with those little things. That micro break thing, I was like, I can do that at work. It was just so brilliant. So thank you so much. We're going to have lunch. And we've made some decisions around the rest of the day, so there's not quite as many people as we thought. But what we'll do is we just won't split the afternoon. So we'll have lunch. We've got an hour. We've got some pet therapy dogs and their handlers coming in. I'm aware that we've got a couple of individuals who are not keen on dogs. There's actually a dual exercise running with that. So it's going to be a case of we're looking for some feedback. We're looking at putting this stuff into practice, thinking about making some pledges, and also trying to share with us some information on what would be useful for you guys moving forward. One of the things we really struggle with is finding out information of kind of why this worked for you, why you think it was helpful for you, why did you come today, whereas we didn't get as many people as we were hoping for, even though they signed up, even though the tickets were kind of done and the reminders were sent. So anything you can help us with the insight, that shared group knowledge, the hive mind, would be really appreciative. And then what we'll do is we'll let the pet therapy guys go. There's an opportunity for dual learning there as well, because you can get them in to see your patients as well as just appreciate what they do in the day. So use them for yourself, but also find out a little bit and then give us that feedback. And then we'll finish off on the styles and the imposter syndrome stuff. Does that sound okay? Please feel free to eat well, but whatever you like. And then if you like some extra bits and pieces, that's fine. But we'll break for an hour if that's all right. There's a fab restaurant and there's an outside space as well. So please do use it. And thanks again to Celine. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was really brilliant. I can't believe I scored 1.
There's loads.
Oh, have you got some?
Oh, yeah. I bought 200.
Oh, wow.
Hi, Celine. I have
Yes,
a
that's very true.
question, if you
Sure.
don't mind.
I don't mind. I'm going to stop recording. Otherwise,
Has
there
everyone
we
got
go.
the